When Shadow Brook rose above the waters of Stockbridge, Massachusetts in 1893, it was very likely the largest private house in all of America, and very likely still the second largest house built in the country to this day. Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit that subscribe button and let's explore this house. In 1838, Anson Phelps Stokes was born into one of the most successful commercial dynasties in the United States. His family stood at the very center of Phelps Dodge & Company, the metals and mining house that had grown from a copper and import business into one of the greatest American fortunes of the 19th century. He entered business in New York and in time founded the banking house of Phelps, Stokes & Company, lending his name and his connections to the world of high finance. He married his cousin, Helen Louisa Phelps, binding two branches of the clan still more tightly together, and the couple raised a remarkable family of 9 children. By the closing decades of the 19th century, Stokes was a fixture of New York society, a man of clubs and country pursuits quite as much as the ledgers and counting houses. It was in this confident season of his life, with the family name standing at its very height, that he set out to build a summer home in the Berkshire Hills on a scale that no private citizen had ever attempted. To build his Berkshire seat, Stokes turned to H. Neil Wilson, an architect based in Pittsfield who knew the region well and understood its growing appetite for grand summer cottages. The work stretched across the early 1890s and reached completion in 1893, producing a house of roughly 100 rooms set high above Lake Mahkeenac, the broad sheet of water also known as the Stockbridge Bowl. For one brief moment, before George Vanderbilt finished Biltmore down in North Carolina, Shadow Brook was reckoned the largest private residence in the entire country. It was conceived throughout in the English manner, a sprawling Tudor and Elizabethan composition that looked less like a single building than like a small village that had slowly grown together over many centuries. Seen from the carriage approach, the house presented an immensely long and broken silhouette, its wings and gables marching across the crown of the hill in a line that seemed almost to have no end. The principal entrance front drew the eye toward a deep porte-cochere, a covered carriage porch where guests could step down out of the weather before passing through the great door. The doorway itself was set in carved stone beneath a broad arch, a deliberately grand opening that promised the scale of the rooms waiting inside. From nearly every vantage, the roof resolved into a procession of steep gables, no two of them quite alike, stepping and overlapping in the picturesque manner the style so prized. Tall chimney stacks rose in clusters along the ridges like a small forest of masonry, a frank expression of just how many fireplaces a house of 100 rooms truly required. The upper walls carried the dark geometry of half timbering laid against panels of pale stucco, the unmistakable badge of the Tudor and Elizabethan revival. Lower down, the building was grounded in stone and brick, a heavier base that tied the lighter timberwork above firmly into the hillside. Along that garden front stretched a broad piazza, a sheltered open-air veranda where the household could sit above the valley in the cool of the afternoon. A stone terrace ran beneath the lower walls and carried the architecture outward into the gardens by way of balustrades and shallow flights of steps. The estate that wrapped around the house ran to many hundreds of acres of hill, meadow, and woodland, rolling steadily down toward the edge of the lake. A long private drive climbed from the public road and curved upward through the grounds, drawing out the arrivals so that the great house disclosed itself only by slow degrees. From the crest of the hill, the lawns fell away in smooth, carefully tended slopes that ran without interruption all the way toward the water below. Nearer the house, formal gardens and planted terraces brought pattern, color, and a measure of order right up to the foot of the walls. Among the outbuildings stood a substantial stable and carriage house, sheltering the horses and the array of vehicles that a household on this scale simply could not do without. A gate lodge guarded the entrance to the property and housed the staff who watched over the comings and goings of the family, guests, and tradesmen alike. Working barns and farm buildings supported the estate from behind the scenes, keeping it supplied in the manner expected of a self-sufficient country place. Greenhouses in the gardener's own structures kept flowers on the tables and produce in the kitchens through the long swing of the New England seasons. A surviving photograph from the years of the building shows Shadow Brook still rising from its foundations, the bare timber framing and the webs of scaffolding making plain the sheer ambition of the project long before the first room was ever finished. Now, if the exterior impressed chiefly by its extent, the interior was where the house truly performed, leading visitors through a carefully ordered sequence of rooms that climbed from the simply welcoming to the frankly spectacular. The entrance hall set the key the very instant a visitor crossed the threshold, A generous paneled room whose dark woodwork, heavy beams, and broad expanses of carved oak carried the Tudor theme firmly indoors. A large fireplace anchored the space and offered the first warmth of welcome, while the eye was drawn almost at once toward the staircase and the procession of grander rooms beyond. The grand staircase was one of the true architectural set pieces of the house, rising in richly carved wood out of the entrance hall toward the floors above. At the landing, the stair paused and turned, and a great window threw daylight across the steps while framing a composed view out over the grounds. Carved newel posts and an elaborately worked balustrade carried the craftsmanship of the lower rooms upward, turning the simple act of climbing the stairs into something closer to a small procession. The library was a quieter and more enclosing room, finished in warm, deep-toned wood that invited long hours of reading and retreat from the bustle of a full house. Its own fireplace and comfortable proportions made it one of the few genuinely intimate corners in a building otherwise conceived for crowds and ceremony. The parlor struck a lighter and more refined note, a drawing room meant for receiving callers and passing the formal daytime hours of a country visit. Where the entrance hall and the library leaned dark and solid, the parlor opened up with finer plasterwork and a more delicate hand in its detailing and color. Tall windows drew the garden light deep into the room and tied it visually to the lawns and terraces just outside. It was in a room such as this that much of the everyday social life of the house quietly turned. The piazza carried the living space out into the open air, a broad covered veranda stood along the side of the house that looked toward the lake. From its shade, the family and their guests could take in the whole sweep of water and hills while remaining comfortably sheltered from the sun and from the sudden weather of the high country. The Pompeian Hall was the great surprise of the interior, a richly classical room that stood in deliberate and startling contrast to the English Tudor character of the rest of the house. Taking both its name and its decoration from the rediscovered art of ancient Rome, it brought columns, classical motifs, and a warmer, more formal palette into a building otherwise given over to half timbering and carved oak. Very few private houses anywhere in America could boast a room of quite this character. The ballroom was the largest of all the entertaining rooms, built expressly for the kind of grand gatherings that justified the enormous expense of a house like this in the first place. Its sheer scale set it apart from every other room under the roof, a broad and lofty volume cleared for music, for dancing, and for the great assemblies of the summer season. Filled with sunlight from its tall windows by day, and after dark, with the glow of bulbs nestled within its ceiling's rosettes, the room could turn in an instant from a silent hall into the beating social heart of the house. The dining room held the dignity proper to the room where the household and its guests assembled day after day, finished in rich paneling and arranged around a table which could be made long enough to seat a considerable company with the addition of dozens of leaves. The triumph of Shadow Brook did not last long. Financial reverses overtook Stokes not many years after the house was finished, and the great Berkshire seat slipped out of the family's hands. In time, the property became linked with one of the most famous names of the entire era, Andrew Carnegie, who spent his last summers at Shadow Brook and died there in 1919. After Carnegie's passing, the day of the private pleasure palace was clearly fading, and in 1922, the Society of Jesus acquired the estate and turned the great house into a retreat for the training of young Jesuits. For more than 3 decades, the building served this new and utterly different life, its ballrooms and grand halls now given over to study, to discipline, and to prayer. Then, in the middle of the night in March of 1956, a boiler experienced an oil explosion and fire tore through the aging mansion, completely consuming it. The cost of rebuilding would have been too high and too impractical, so a more utilitarian building was put in its place. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. What did you think about Shadow Brook? Let me know down below in the comments section, and while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.